Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Hemenway. This is my colleague Anna McCarthy, and we're here with our next session of your morning briefing, which is our monthly webinar series designed to keep you informed and up to date on various labor and employment topics, all in the time it takes to finish a morning cup of coffee.
Of which I have right here. Good morning, Amy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, so today's morning briefing is going to cover the high points of employers using artificial intelligence, particularly in the areas that we would expect our HR professionals to use it, hiring and recruiting. We will have a second session, which will delve more into using AI with current employees for performance management and things like that. Today, though, our focus is on candidates and using it with hiring and recruiting. And we know that AI has the power to be transformative for HR professionals by removing some of the administrative work that they do and
Right.
allowing them to focus on actual decision making and um, that more important strategy work.
Mhm.
So we'll talk about these tools, we'll highlight the opportunities that they have for professionals, but also the legal risks that may come with them. And we'll try to provide some practical considerations for whether and how to implement these tools.
Yeah, and this is definitely, I mean, as you've already sort of laid out, Amy, this is quite an expansive topic. There's a lot to cover and a lot that's still evolving and developing, and in terms of case law and guidance and state statutory law, perhaps even federal statutory law at some point. So as you mentioned, this session is only going to focus on one aspect, on recruiting and hiring, but we'll maybe have another session on sort of the handling of current employees or the use of AI with current employees, so the policy making side of things, the performance evaluation and management. Before we dive into all of that good information that Amy just went over, I just like to cover a few housekeeping items as we always do. So this webinar has been approved for a half credit of HRCI and SHRM credit, not CLE credit this time. But we will, and so we'll give some instructions at the end on how to submit for HRCI and SHRM credit. And as always, this webinar is intended for general information purposes only and should not be considered as legal advice. All participants' lines are placed on mute. So to submit questions, please use the Q&A widget on your toolbar down below. Don't use the raise hand feature or the chat because we won't see those. So with those housekeeping and logistics out of the way, although please throw a question in the Q&A if I didn't cover something logistics wise that you need addressed. But Amy, where are we going to start with our substantive topics?
Well, and I think, like I said, we'll start with some hiring and recruitment topics. There are several opportunities for AI in hiring and recruitment. One of the first areas that you might see relates to job descriptions, right? Employers are always fine-tuning job descriptions, creating new job descriptions, and you can use AI tools to help do that. And they can help create descriptions that are going to appeal to a diverse, high-quality candidate pool. You're able to feed in the criteria that you really need for a successful candidate. AI can help provide phrasing and other help you identify related skills that you may not initially be thinking about. So using AI in that regard can be very helpful. It can also help reduce unintended bias in job descriptions because they're using more neutral language. That's what the AI tools are intended to do. But it is still important to make sure that any job description that you're creating using AI includes all the key skills and qualifications, and that it thinks about it and addresses the unique aspects of your particular work environment. So if there are specific things that you need within your workforce that may not fit similar jobs elsewhere, right? That there's unique aspects to your work environment. You want to make sure those are incorporated in some way in any job description. So it's important to keep that in mind.
That's a great point. And then maybe conversely, definitely once that AI tool spits out the information, take a critical eye to what it spit out, because maybe it's included job skills or job duties that aren't really relevant to your particular workforce. AI is only so helpful, and doesn't necessarily or won't necessarily take into consideration, like you said, the unique aspects of the particular work environment. Certainly, if you provide that information to the tool, it might be taken into consideration. And we've seen this often, I think, in the legal industry where someone will use an AI tool, but then not really be thoughtful about reviewing all of that information that's spit out to make sure that it makes sense. And that it can be implemented in reality. And those job descriptions can come in real handy when you're talking about providing accommodations, managing performance. And you definitely don't want to be looking at that job description for the first time when you actually need to use it.
That's correct. Yes.
So definitely be mindful of the information that's being spit out of that AI tool, and making sure that it makes sense for what you need it to do. Because job descriptions, while not absolutely required, should be a useful tool and not a hindrance to the day-to-day of your work environment. So what else besides job descriptions? What's another way that HR can use AI as a tool in the work environment, specifically for hiring and recruiting?
So I think another way that they can use them are with resume screening.
Mm.
And there are some other applications that they can be used with, including engaging with clients.
Mm.
So employers may rely on chatbots to engage with clients by answering questions, collecting information from them, helping to schedule interviews, or other administrative tasks. So we all, are familiar with the little pop-up in a window. My name is so and so. How can I help you?
Sure.
And you put your question in and you get your answer very efficiently, right?
Mhm.
Those, we're starting to see those, and we're starting to see employers use those in the screening process to help either gather information, answer basic questions that may arise about a job. It can lighten the workload for recruiting teams who spend a lot of time interacting with candidates and answering questions that are important to the candidate, but not necessarily is helpful in moving candidates forward. So
Sure.
using AI for that can be very useful, and it ensures that candidates are getting a timely response, right? Almost immediate if they use that chatbot. But we need to remember that the chatbot is an algorithm. It's not a person. It needs to be trained and sort of developed in a way that complies with your local laws, right? If you're using a chatbot that's set up for another state's laws, that's not going to be helpful to you. It may ask questions that are inappropriate, or may provide answers that are not in line with what your business needs. So the development of the chatbot, the training of the chatbot, or your AI assistant is really important, and you need to put time in with that.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to the type of information that you're feeding into the chatbot, or the tool that you're using. So if you're getting it from a vendor, understanding that tool before you're implementing it is so critical. And I think it might be useful, and I've seen this when those auto chatbots pop up on websites like you mentioned. I've seen that sometimes there is an option to speak to a human. And I think that that's probably something that you want to consider in if you're going to use a chatbot in this particular scenario. There may be a question that the chatbot spits out a confusing answer to, and the candidate really needs to speak to someone live. There may be an issue that the candidate raises that's really critical for HR to understand and have knowledge of, that the chatbot, so that the chatbot is not the only resource that's understanding this information or having this information. So one of those examples could be an accommodation that a candidate needs, right? So the candidate needs an accommodation for the interview, or somehow through the application process. And that's information that would be really critical for HR to know, particularly if HR is going to be conducting in-person interviews and they need to know that before those interviews happen. So whether it's AI flagging certain keywords, or it's having, maybe even a better measure would be having an HR representative ensuring that they're providing some oversight to the information that's being spit out of these chatbots, to ensure that they're catching these sort of very specific, nuanced issues that the chatbot may not be fully addressing in the right way. So either maybe that option to speak to a live human, or again, the oversight of the information that is being generated.
Great. So I mentioned resume screening. Could you talk a little bit about that too?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So another aspect of hiring and recruiting. So AI technology can be very helpful, particularly for employers in resume screening, and that's particularly for employers that are really large and get just stacks and stacks of resumes in, and they need some way of narrowing down the search that doesn't take up hours and hours of HR's time. So in that way, certainly an AI tool can be helpful for resume culling, just to narrow down a really, really broad candidate pool. Of course, however, you need to make sure that it's being done in a way where bias is not being introduced into
Mhm.
that sort of auto culling of these resumes. Because just as humans can insert bias into this process, AI, which is based on algorithms, that's based on information from humans, can also unintentionally insert bias into the process. So while AI can be a tool to use to reduce bias, human bias, and it can certainly save time, it can also conversely do the opposite, the exact opposite of those two things. So it could end up wasting time if it's not pulling the correct resumes or the right resumes for the job, and it could also unintentionally be inserting some bias into the process if it's relying on factors that we wouldn't otherwise as humans be relying on, because we understand that it might be a violation of the law to rely on a particular factor. Now, are other applications besides the ones we've talked about. So we've talked about job descriptions, resume culling, use of AI for communications with employees. You could also use AI tools to assess video interviews. You could use AI to analyze candidate data, for example, to think about changing or modifying your recruiting efforts.
Right.
Anecdotally, I'll share that someone mentioned the other day they had heard of someone doing a candidate interview, or they themselves were the interviewee. And the potential employer was using some sort of AI tool to analyze the amount of attention that the candidate was paying to the video while they were being interviewed. So, were their eyes directed at the camera? Were they exhibiting signs of being interested
Yeah.
and engaged? I mean, some potentially kind of Big Brother type stuff.
Yeah.
So these tools can have some utility, but I think we have to be thoughtful about how we're implementing them. And in that scenario, I wonder how the candidate might react to being monitored like that. Does
Right.
it turn them off from the job? So certainly something to consider when you're implementing these types of tools.
Yeah. So one other area where employers might want to use AI is with
Mhm.
note taking, right? You're meeting with candidates, you're taking notes of the interview,
Mhm.
you're uh, creating to-do lists based on what you talk about. AI can be a really useful partner in that by creating transcripts or summaries of phone calls and interviews
Mhm.
with candidates, by creating to-do lists based on those summaries or transcripts that it prepares. And it's a basic function. It's a great place to start if you're looking to try to introduce AI into your process. But we want to make sure that we remember AI isn't perfect, just like a human.
Right.
Transcripts and summaries may contain errors, there may be omissions within them. So they need to be reviewed carefully for accuracy very soon after they're generated, right? When the meeting that was recorded by that AI tool is still fresh in someone's mind.
Mhm.
The other thing that AI tools may not capture in written transcripts or summaries are your personal impressions of a candidate.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's something you would need to add to any notes or summaries that are prepared by an AI tool. It's not going to capture, if you notice the candidate not paying attention or the candidate was messing with their phone. Things that aren't verbal may not be picked up and noted in any type of written summary. Um, you want to consider when notes and summaries are really necessary. Sometimes, discussions are better left undocumented. Now, as lawyers, we, we don't want to say hide the ball here, but there are times when you may be having a privileged discussion about someone's medical condition or
Mhm.
um, a confidential discussion about someone's childcare situation, and that's not something you necessarily want to have documented. because it shouldn't be part of the decision making, right? And putting it into that AI tool may then allow the AI tool to view that as a factor that it then takes into consideration in some impermissible way.
Yeah, that last point is a great one, because especially if there's a maybe a central repository where all of these transcripts are
Right.
going, you definitely don't want the confidential conversations mixed up into sort of the general HR conversations.
Right. And the other thing to remember is some jurisdictions have consent requirements.
Mhm.
So if you are using an AI tool to record whether a verbal conversation or some kind of video interaction, there may be requirements depending on where you are
Mhm.
that you need to at least inform the other party that you're using that tool. And in some cases, you may need to obtain their actual consent to do so. So you want to make sure that you're upfront with applicants, not hiding the ball. Let them know if you're using an AI tool, either to actually record an interaction or to create a summary of it. And then, just like any other document that you create in connection with your hiring process, your AI notes are going to be discoverable, right? So that they're subject to document retention policies. You may need to update your policies to account for how you're going to store and retain any type of AI notes or AI generated documents and reports.
That's that actually came up in my own sort of day-to-day working life. I needed access to some information about a Zoom call I had had, just the length of time that I had had the call. But I didn't know how to access that information. It was stored somewhere, and I knew there was a way to get it, but I didn't know how to. And so really, fortunately, we have a wonderful IT department that was able to point me in the right direction. But understanding, particularly if you're a smaller business who can't afford a whole IT department, or it's just really not necessary for your business, really understanding the tools that you're implementing, including where things are being stored and how they're being stored, or if they're being stored at all, is so critical to the use of these technologies. So we've definitely touched on the potential consequences of using AI, or the potential negative consequences of using AI. I think we've talked about some of the maybe potential sticky areas. So I want to delve into that a little bit more, just so it's sort of clear where the potential pitfalls are. Now, certainly, in our world, the implications could, or rather, the use of AI tools could implement any number of anti-discrimination laws. Title VII, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, could implement the Americans with Disabilities Act if we're talking about accommodations, and the way that AI is being used to engage with candidates that might need accommodations. So there's any number of laws that could potentially be implemented here, or implicated here. And so, to that end, I think current case law is somewhat instructive, even though AI is a relatively new tool. We can certainly draw on our current understanding of non-discrimination laws for how courts and state agencies and federal agencies might view the use of AI tools going forward, even if it's not a guarantee, because of course it's such a new technology. So I think it's important to think about the fact that the algorithms that AI is based on are based on information. Those algorithms are based on information that the creators of that AI tool have put into that tool to help it build and understand and evolve. And so there may be some unintentional bias inserted into that process. Certainly, as algorithms evolve because of user information, the bias may be inserted into that process because it's relying on user information to grow and evolve and change. So the longer an AI tool is around, the more it might start taking on some of those unwanted tendencies that we're trying to get away from by using the AI tool in the first place.
Similar to a person, really. As you
Absolutely.
learn and go through life and have experiences, it shapes your perspective on things, whether it's intentional or unintentional.
Right.
And the AI tool is really no different.
Yeah. And I think it just ultimately, I think the what we should all understand is that there's probably no foolproof way to guarantee that you're not going to have some sort of bias, perhaps influencing our decision making. But I think it's important to recognize that that is the case so that we can address the fact that there might be bias inserted into the system. It doesn't mean that you have to, eschew all AI tools. It certainly does mean you need to be aware of the potential negative consequences of using them. So one example might be an algorithm that considers years of experience, which on its face seems like a perfectly neutral factor. Years of experience, fine. It doesn't necessarily take into account your race, your age, your gender. Well, your age potentially, depending on whether or not there's a
Really
strict
high.
correlation, right, between age and how long you've been in the industry, for example. But it seems like a facially neutral factor. However, that could disadvantage younger workers, so age potentially, or workers that have taken time away from the industry, whether for a medical reason, for parental leave, whatever it is. And so you can see why or how the use of a neutral factor like that, or a seemingly neutral factor like that, by the AI tool could potentially be problematic. Are there any other factors that we can talk about?
Yeah, so I mean, another example of where AI may, unintentionally infuse some bias or limit opportunities could be with respect to zip code information.
That's a great
So,
one.
right, you're screening resumes and people put their address on there, and you tell the AI tool, you've had a lot of attendance issues. You want people who live close to the facility, right? So that they're more likely to show up for work. They're not driving half an hour, whatever it might be.
That seems
Well,
reasonable.
right, if you provide it with, we want, employees within a certain proximity to the facility, or we're looking for people in a certain zip code, it could be a situation that evolves where the AI tool is focusing in on certain zip codes that are closer and excluding candidates from other zip codes, where there may be racial or socioeconomic implications, and you're unintentionally excluding individuals in a particular race because they're not in the right zip code, or they're not in the right proximity to the facility. And even before AI, there were cases on zip code discrimination.
Absolutely.
But that is something that we think, could become an issue with AI if it's used in certain ways.
And I think that touches on the fact that you're using a tool that was developed by potentially probably someone who doesn't have HR expertise.
Yeah.
And so they're not thinking about these things in the same way that an HR professional or an HR focused attorney, labor and employment attorney might be thinking about these things. So that's why we really have to be thinking critically about the use of these tools. Doesn't mean we can't use them, but it certainly does mean we need to be thoughtful about the fact that the AI creator or the vendor that you're using may not have taken these things into consideration. And ultimately, there's just not a lot of transparency into all of these tools and the way that they've been developed and the way they're being used, partly just because we're so early on in the process of them breaking into this world, the employment world. So that does make it difficult to identify potential issues, or to say that yes, definitely that's going to be a violation of the law, or yes, definitely that's okay under the law. So it does then make it harder for attorneys and for employers to explain their decision making if all they're doing is relying on the AI tool, and they're not also sitting down and actually going through the process of justifying what decisions have come out of whatever process they're going through, whether that's the hiring process, performance management process. As you mentioned, as attorneys, we're always focused on making sure that things are documented and justified in writing so that we can rely on them later. So thinking about the fact that if you use an AI tool, that documentation process is going to look very different.
Right.
And it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's going to exist in a different way. So thinking about the fact that solely using an AI tool cuts that out, and how that can be problematic later for justifying your decisions, is so critical to making sure that you're being responsible with the use of those AI tools. So specifically on these risks, what can we do to mitigate the problems that are out
Yeah.
there?
So I think first and foremost, you're most likely going to rely on a vendor.
Mhm.
to provide some kind of AI tool to you. I don't know a lot of companies that are developing their own in-house tools at this point
Right, sure.
that we're working with. But whether you're relying on a vendor or you're creating your own tool, you want to make sure that your tool is not discriminatory from the start, right? So you want to ask your vendor if they've done a bias audit. And if they have, what have the results of that audit been? You want to know that up front. And you want to confirm that they're conducting regular periodic audits as the tool continues to evolve and live, not just with your data, but more broadly, right? You know, if they're finding a problem with another employer's data, that's something you'd want to know about. You want to make sure that any AI tool is trained and compliant for the jurisdiction where you will be using it.
Right.
And if you're in multiple jurisdictions, you want to make sure that you're using the right tool in the right jurisdiction. And that may be, you know, you need to make sure that it can pivot and it can address candidates in the state where they are or the location where they are. And you also want to make sure that in any contract that you have with a vendor for an AI tool, there are indemnification provisions, and you want to assess the data and security privacy measures, which is something we haven't touched on a lot today. We'll touch on it in part 2 of our seminar. But there are certainly data security and privacy risks associated with the use of an AI tool. You also want to make sure you are conducting regular self audits and analysis to determine if that use of the AI tool is resulting in any type of negative impact on a disproportionate basis for any group that's in a protected class. And you want to understand how that tool is trained, what it does, and what it doesn't do. Frankly, it could be because there's a lot of stuff, you know, it's trained to do certain things, which means it's not trained to do other things.
Sure.
And you want to know what the limits are. What questions does it ask? Are any of those questions prohibited where you are? You want to make sure that any employees who are interacting with the tool are trained on the limits of it. They know what to look for, and they know how to spot decisions coming out of the AI tool that may not make sense or that may suggest there's some outcome that's not entirely fair, right? We need that level of human kind of checking of the system, and the decisions should be made by the humans, the ultimate decisions. And you want to spend some time pre-deployment, making sure you're designing and testing the tool by comparing AI outcomes to what you get with your regular practice, right? Is it really going to enhance your regular practice? Are you still getting the types of candidates that you would want? Are you getting better candidates? If it's excluding candidates, are they candidates you would have wanted excluded, right? So doing some testing of that and seeing how it will change your recruiting is important. And once you've adopted that tool, you want to monitor the outcomes. You want to continue to monitor them to make sure they're fair, they're transparent, and there is no bias creeping in.
Right. Another couple of things maybe to think about is thinking about whether or not notice is required. So notice to your candidates that an automated system is being used, that they're speaking to an AI tool rather than a human. And then also, as we talked about before, providing a human alternative potentially. And then we've also mentioned this through various times throughout this half an hour, but making sure you have some measure of human oversight to make sure that AI is supporting your decisions, but not changing them and changing the outcomes, like you were just mentioning. So any parting words of wisdom before we sign off for the day today?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an area that's rapidly evolving.
Yeah.
It's not an area where, you know, you want to run at full speed. I think when we're talking about any employee practice, you want to be mindful, you want to be thoughtful about it. So just, you know, think about how all of this is being regulated, what the best practices are, and try to align anything that you're doing with those.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're just going to, because we're at the top of the hour, we've been trying to address questions as we go. I just want to make sure you have the codes before we sign up for the day. So if you would like HRCI credit for this webinar, the activity ID, which is going to pop up on your screen or should be up momentarily, is 717771. And the SHRM code is 25-KP6 and those codes should be up on the screen as well. So you can enter those into their respective portals to submit for credit. And I'll turn it over to Amy to end today's
Yeah,
session.
so we're at 9 o'clock now. We had two quick questions come in that I'll address very briefly. The first was, are we going to share any content from today's call? We actually are in the process of pulling together a brief article that will
Mhm.
summarize the points that we talked about today, and we'll have a companion piece that will go with our second session that we'll be scheduling. And then the other question related to whether AI can be a helpful tool or create risk with candidates who speak English as a second language. And I think that's a great question.
Yeah.
It is certainly something that you would want to think about, you'd want to monitor, you'd want to make sure that any vendor you're engaging or any tool you're creating, if you expect to have a lot of applicants who may speak English as a second language, you want the tool to be aware of that
Mhm.
and mindful of that. So, when we wrap up today's session, if you have other questions about the content from the webinar, feel free to reach out to Anna, myself, or any other member of our labor and employment group. We'll keep an eye out for an email following the session. It'll have our next scheduled date and topic. We expect, we're aiming for October, but we have some other events going on, including our labor and employment seminar. For anyone who's interested in attending that, you can find information on our website.
That's right, October 21st, right? Save the
I
date.
think it's October 21st. Yeah, it's going to be really fun. It's very interactive, where, it's almost a role playing type seminar. So it should be great. We're looking forward to it. We hope you'll attend. But thank you for attending today. We appreciate you being here, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.